Hey, what's up guys? Chris Draney here for Kriscoart Productions. Welcome to part 2 of a 3-part tutorial series on creating a realistic explosion. So obviously, if you haven't seen the first part, I really highly recommend that you go ahead and check it out. We're gonna make the explosion itself contain a little bit more fire so that it's not just dirt and debris just, scattering everywhere. So that is exactly what we're gonna be doing in this tutorial. So let's jump into After Effects and let's get started. Alright, so we're picking off right where we left in last tutorial. So we have our explosion set up and we're ready to go. So the first thing that we're going to do is add some, some cracks and some burn marks to the ground plane of where this explosion is happening, so on the floor. And this just gives it a little bit more of an interaction with its environment. So we're going to be repeating the same steps as with most of our assets that we imported into our scene. So we're dragging it into the point in time that we want it to be at, and then we're setting it as a 3D layer. But one quick thing that's going to be a little bit different is that we're not placing items right where the grenade is. So I'm going to want to create another track solid from our tracking data as a reference so that we can place these items where we want them to be in our scene. So I'm going to right click on this area here and create a track solid. And of course we can create as many of these as we want. And it's always good to name these. So I'll pick the one close to the explosion. I'm going to copy the position. And now you can see that all the steps are pretty much the same as what we did before. So I'm going to turn back on my damage layer here, paste the position, then copy the orientation because we want it to lay flat on the floor, and paste that as well onto our damage layer. So now it's sticking to the ground. We can turn these off so that we can see what we did here. And great, so it's not quite facing the direction I want, so I'm going to flip this over, and you can scale this up, scale it down, move it around. Just make sure you're not moving it up and down because that's going to make it look like it's floating. So we can set this to multiply on our transfer modes, and that will get rid of all the white. And it's looking pretty good. Now we need to add a mask just so we can animate it so that it expands out as the explosion is happening. And you can set a keyframe for the mask path right at the beginning of the explosion, and then as the explosion happens, we can expand this mask out. You can also play around with the mask expansion, but this gives you a little bit more freedom. So we have the animation set up, and a good thing to do would be to feather this mask so that's not just a sharp line. But right now I'm going to get rid of one more thing, and in the beginning here we see a little bit of it, so we can just set the opacity to 0 so that it's not just popping out of nowhere. So now that we have this layer in our scene, you can duplicate it moving around and add as much damage to the ground plane as you want. And again, just make sure that it never looks the same, so rotate it, scale it up and down a little bit, and just modify it. But now we're having sort of a similar issue that we had before. It's not looking quite right. So you can just play around, and it might look right in different points of time of the explosion, but then it could look completely wrong in another point in time of the explosion. So make sure you're scrolling through back and forth. I'm going to make him a little bit more subtle, and that's just preference. To do that, since we animated the opacity, you need to go to the last keyframe of the opacity and just set it to a little bit lower so that it blends with the ground a little bit better. Then you can offset some of these damaged textures so that they're not all happening at once. And then once you're happy with the result, you can move on adding some cracks and pretty much whatever your scene calls for. So we're doing the same exact thing, so I'm speeding through this a little bit quicker. We're just positioning it, and then we're setting this to overlay instead of, multiply. A good rule of thumb when using transfer modes, if you want to get rid of something that has white, you can use multiply or screen. And if you're trying to get rid of something that has sort of like a 50% gray color to it, then you can use overlay or soft light. So these cracks are looking pretty good, but I think the perspective is a little bit off. That has nothing to do with our orientation. It's just that the asset itself was already at a certain angle. So what we can do to fix this is add an effect called corner pin, and you can sort of adjust the perspective of that. Then you can add a mask. It's kind of tricky when you're using corner pin and you're adding masks, but for this particular example, we won't have too much of an issue. So you can move it to where the explosion is, and that's looking pretty good. And then we can feather that mask out so that we don't have any sharp edges. I'm noticing that these cracks are a little bit too sharp when compared to our footage. So I'm going to add another effect called fast blur, and just to blur these edges out a little bit. Now this all depends, finding the sweet spot of all these values depends on your scene, your asset, and just your personal taste, so just play around until it looks right to you. Okay, so let's go into our explosion comp real quick, and let's just modify a few things. I want to give it the illusion of depth even more than just that feeling of parallax that we created. So what I'm going to do is, for the elements that are more towards the background in our tint effect, I'm going to select a black and make it sort of a grayish. And this is sort of like following the principle of like atmospheric depth when you're doing matte paintings, for example. And you can see this in pictures all the time. When you're shooting a landscape, you can see that things that are far away from the camera, like mountains and things, are usually a lot less rich in contrast than elements that are closer to you. So that's sort of what we're going for here. Of course, it's not really that noticeable when the object is this close to you, but still adding these little details here and there can sort of give this explosion a little bit more depth. Now, one last thing that we can do before moving on to the next part is adding a little bit of motion blur. So just adding a bit of a more visceral feel to this explosion. And you can do this a couple of ways. You can add a directional blur, depending on, if your explosion is going in one direction and shooting out of a building or something like that. But in this case, I'm actually going to add a radial blur. And you can use CC radial blur or just a regular radial blur. So select center zoom on the type of radial blur, and then we're just going to be doing a little bit of animating with the amount. So you can see sort of the effect and what it does. What we can do is sort of set keyframes for the amount and go to the beginning of your explosion. And by the way, we can get rid of that directional blur. So as it first erupts, we have a lot of motion blur, and then as it's sort of still expanding out, we're lowering the motion blur quite a bit, and then we're setting one last keyframe at the very end so that it just has no motion blur at all. So of course, this isn't really motion blur, we're just kind of faking it, but I think it adds a lot more impact to the explosion. Okay, so finally, let's add some fire elements into this explosion. Now, this part is going to be really tricky. So before we jump in and do this step by step, let's just have a clear picture of what we're doing. And essentially what we're doing is grabbing these fireball assets, and we're going to be using them sort of as a way to texturize our main dirt explosion that we have. So our landmine asset from detonation films, we're adding a little bit of fire texture to it, except it's not really a texture, it's a video. So select a few that you like, and let's drag it into our explosion comp. So make it a 3D layer and place it just below the front part of the explosion. By the way, it's always good to name these. I should have done this in the beginning. Could avoid a lot of confusion. So we're going to name this explosion fire matte, so you can sort of see where we're going with this. And I'm going to place the fireball below that. And then I'm going to set the explosion fire matte as its alpha matte. So we don't see anything change, but as I scale this up, you can start to notice that the explosion is being contained inside that other dirt explosion, the explosion fire matte. So that is the main principle behind all of the next steps that we're going to be doing to add fire elements to this explosion. Now, we've explored mattes on this channel, and they're used quite often, but I've actually never seen them used this way. You can sort of texturize explosions and customize them to give it, the amount of fire and the type of look that you want. So this is a great way of just fitting the assets that you have to the needs of your scene. So again, what we're doing is we're importing fireballs and we're duplicating the the explosion that we already had in our explosion comp, and we're setting that duplicate layer as the alpha matte of the fireballs that we're importing. So this is sort of why this is kind of an advanced tutorial, because if you're not too familiar with mattes or if you haven't used them already, this can get very confusing. But if you are feeling a little bit confused, as always, as you can see from the info annotation on the top right, I'm always linking to tutorials, to previous tutorials on my channel that go in depth to everything that we're talking about. So if you ever feel stuck, go ahead and check out some of the more basic tutorials and then jump back into this tutorial with a better understanding of that one particular technique. So what you want to do is just sort of move this around, find a good spot for it, and then of course you can duplicate it, and you can create masks so that it's, we don't see any sharp edges, and feather that out. And then we can set it to add or screen as a transfer mode. This will just sort of make it a lot vibrant, and it will make it blend a little bit better. But if that's too intense, you can always set some of these assets to screen. So just play around between those two transfer modes and see which one suits the explosion better. So then we can add a glow effect, and this is sort of gonna
help us illuminate the fire part of the explosion blend with the smoky part of the explosion. So you can bring in as many different assets as you want. So we added some fire to most of the back of the explosion, but we still have this front element of the explosion that's still just dirt. So let's add a fireball, and we're repeating the same steps. So I'm time stretching this asset to be a little bit quicker. Then what we want to do is grab that front element, duplicate it, set the fireball to have its alpha matte be the duplicate layer so that it's contained in that front element. You know, we can copy the glow effect and set that fireball asset to add, and you can see that we have some fire in the front element of the explosion as well. So again, you can play around with the opacity and make it a little bit less intense as the explosion is, you know, just happening over time. And another thing that you can do instead of just playing around with the opacity is messing around with some fast blur. So I'm actually going to do that right now. And let's drop this in, and as the explosion is happening, we can sort of blur it out as it's as the explosion is evolving. So don't do it too much. Maybe this is a little bit too much. If you find the right balance between blurring it out and playing around with the opacity, some of these fireball assets could just function as a way of illuminating the explosion. So that could be something that's very interesting. And in the end, I think you want to find a compromise between using this technique to sort of illuminate the explosion from other fire elements that you're going to be adding, and actually adding those fire elements to that explosion. So I'm noticing that there is quite a bit too much yellow going on, and that's because we have a lot of fireball assets that are overlapping onto each other. We added a glow effect, they're all set to add, so it's just kind of smushing into a blob of yellow. Now what we can do to sort of eliminate some of those yellows is you can either add a curves effect, and you can boost some of the reds, bring down some of the greens and some of the blues that create that yellow, or you can simply add a tint effect and then click on the map to white and then make it either red or sort of a orangish, deep orange color. And then of course you can play with the amount of tint so that it's not too extreme. Alright guys, I think I'm going to end the tutorial right here. That is because I'm going to be repeating the same steps over and over, and this tutorial is starting to get pretty long and I don't want to bore you guys too much. But essentially the technique is this, and it's very simple. You just duplicate the dirt part of this explosion, so in my case this landmine explosion from Detonation Films, and then you can bring in a fire asset or a fireball asset and use the duplicate layer as the alpha matte for that fire element so that it acts sort of as a container for that fireball to live in, and it won't go past or escape the perimeter designated by the alpha matte. So that's pretty much all we did. And then of course you can modify the color of the explosion just like I showed you in the last couple of steps, which is a simple tint effect or adding a curves effect and messing around with all the different RGB channels until you find something that looks right to you. And if you're not feeling too sure about whether the explosion is looking right or if it's realistic, a good thing to do is just look for reference footage. Anything that you can find, go ahead and look for images, videos. There are a ton of videos on YouTube of real explosions, so definitely look those up and see what explosion looks like. Alright guys, so I realize this could have been a little bit confusing, so if it was, and if this is your first time hearing about mattes and all that sort of stuff, definitely check out the tutorials that were suggested in the top right, and I really look forward to seeing you guys in part 3 where we finally polish this all off, make it look nice and explosion-y, and we add some lens flares, we add some light effects. Right now it's not looking so great, but we're gonna fix all of that in part 3. So thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Kriscoart for Kriscoart Productions, and I'll see you next time.